The German night fighter pilot never saw it coming. 1 second he was gliding through the darkness over the Ruhr, eyes fixed on the faint glow of searchlights stabbing vertical lines into the sky, and the next, a shadow moved behind him. Not a light, not a reflection, a shadow, a shape of something darker than the night itself, sliding just beneath his tailplane with a silence that didn't belong in the sky. He frowned, craned his neck, scanning for a glimmer of navigation lights, a hint of exhaust flame, anything that would tell him what had just passed behind him. There was nothing, just black sky and the hum of his own Jumo engines. He swallowed. Something didn't feel right. The Luftwaffe trained its night fighter pilots to detect the subtlest cues, engine harmonics, shifts in starlight, ripples of air pressure. But this felt like being watched by something without eyes. He banked gently left, trying to reposition over the industrial district glowing faintly beneath him. The bomber stream was close. He could sense it. Dozens of RAF heavies lumbering through the dark. Halifaxes, Sterlings, and the big Lancasters, each dropping tons of explosives onto targets he'd sworn to protect. But tonight felt wrong. Too quiet. Too empty. Too still. His radar operator behind him murmured into the intercom. Nothing on the scope. Nothing at all. He tapped the screen, as if that would coax a contact to appear. It's clear. And that was the last thing either of them said, because the RAF night fighter that had been following them, close enough to see the rivets on the tail, squeezed its trigger. 3 bursts of brown-orange flame erupted from the British guns, stitching upward into the German fuselage. The night sky lit for a second with the glow of impact. The German pilot didn't even have time to scream. The aircraft rolled, caught fire, and spiraled down like a burning ember falling from the heavens. The British pilot pulled up through the darkness, engines humming, lights still off. He didn't need them. He had something better, something the Germans hadn't anticipated, hadn't trained for, hadn't imagined. Stealth. In the air. At night. Absolute, suffocating stealth. This was the birth of a new kind of warfare, one fought not with dogfights under bright skies, but with ambushes in pure darkness, aircraft stalking each other like hunters slipping through black forests. And the RAF had learned something crucial, something that changed the entire air war. If you turned off your lights, turned off your silhouette, turned off your presence, you didn't just disappear. You became a predator. The Luftwaffe never saw it coming because until that moment, night combat had rules. Rules everyone followed. Rules that said aircraft should display minimal lighting so they didn't collide. Rules that said navigation lights should flash intermittently so friendly aircraft didn't mistake each other for enemies. Rules born from the early, chaotic years of the war when night skies were crowded with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of aircraft. The RAF broke those rules, quietly, deliberately, completely. And the moment they did, the entire dynamic of night combat tilted in their favor. If you enjoy being pulled into these immersive, atmospheric World War II stories, the kind that unfold like a movie in your head and reveal how things actually happened, subscribing helps keep these deep dives coming. But let's stay in the sky for now, because the Real story begins long before the first German pilot fell to an unseen hunter. It begins with panic and invention and desperation. It begins with the RAF staring at the night sky in 1940 and realizing they had no idea what was happening inside it. Night bombing was supposed to keep crews safe. Instead, it turned them blind. German night fighters shredded early British bomber streams, slipping beneath them, beside them, behind them, picking off the slow, silhouetted giants one by one. RAF crews described the night sky over occupied Europe as a sea of black teeth, jaws closing invisibly around aircraft that never saw their killers. Something had to change, and the change didn't come from a big new engine, or a new radar, or a new tactic dreamed up in headquarters. It came from a simple, almost primitive idea. If the Germans rely on seeing us, we take away everything they can see. Turn off the lights. Turn off the beacons. Turn off the visibility rules. Turn off the sky. RAF night fighter squadrons began experimenting quietly, first in coastal regions, then deeper inland, flying test missions where every light inside and outside the aircraft was extinguished. Pilots described the experience as flying inside a void, a blackness so complete that the wings seemed to vanish. But inside that darkness, something incredible happened. They began to see everything else. German aircraft, even with minimal lights, stood out like silhouettes cut from tin. Their exhaust flames glowed faintly against the stars. Their wings reflected tiny pieces of moonlight. Their navigation lamps, dimmed for safety, still blinked like beacons once your eyes adjusted to the dark. And British eyes did adjust. Quickly. Night fighter pilots learned to read the sky like hunters read forests. Every shimmer a clue, every shadow a shape, every flicker a story. They stopped relying on instruments alone. They started relying on senses sharpened to a razor's edge. With lights off, their aircraft became invisible, and in that invisibility, they found power. German crews never expected this, because they assumed the British needed light to survive. They didn't realize the British needed darkness to kill. As the RAF adopted the tactic, encounters shifted. The hunted became hunters. The hunted looked over their shoulders into nothing. And the first time the Luftwaffe realized the British had begun killing without being seen, it was already too late. The first crew to truly understand what darkness could do was flying a Beaufighter over the channel on a night so black it felt like the world had been swallowed whole. The pilot, a tall, sharp-faced man named Fowler, tightened his grip on the control column as the aircraft slid through layers of cold, damp air that pressed against the canopy like invisible hands. Clouds drifted beneath them like drifting mountains of ink. Above, the stars were faint, tiny splinters of light trembling in the vast emptiness. His radar operator sat behind him, breathing heavily through his mask, glancing from screen to darkness, from darkness to screen, each beat of his pulse louder than the hum of the engines. Fowler had flown night missions before, but never like this. Never with every single light inside the cockpit extinguished. Never with the faint glow from instruments taped over. Never with the cockpit so dark that he could barely see his own hands outside the tiny sliver of moonlight that brushed his fingertips when he lifted them toward the canopy. He felt blind, yet strangely alert. His eyes strained to make sense of the void outside, but instead of shapes, he saw movement. Waves in the darkness, the subtle shifts in starlight when something passed across them, the tiny tremors in the wind when a distant aircraft disrupted the air. His senses sharpened, not because of training, but because of something older and deeper inside him. Humans were not meant to fly in darkness. Instinct screamed at him to turn the lights back on. But instinct also sharpened his focus, stretched his hearing, tightened his perception until the night around him felt almost alive. The radio crackled softly. His radar operator whispered, barely audible, something maybe at 10 o'clock. Hard to tell. Intermittent, faint return. Fowler didn't answer. He couldn't trust his voice not to betray the cold, not tightening in his stomach. Instead, he adjusted the throttle slightly, feeling the engines respond with a low, steady growl. The Beaufighters slid forward into the black, each meter of air ahead of them, an uncharted abyss. His hands were steady, too steady, almost unnatural. Adrenaline did that. It smoothed out fear until it became focus, a sensation that felt both unnatural and razor-sharp. The radar blip returned, stronger this time, then vanished again, then returned. Something was out there. The operator leaned closer to the screen, breath fogging the glass. Range decreasing, maybe 4,000 yards. Fowler peered into the night. Nothing. Just swirling darkness shifting around the edges of his vision. He throttled up slightly, angling the aircraft subtly to the left. The air shuddered against the wings. He blinked, eyes burning from strain. Then he saw it. Not a shape, not a light, just the faintest shadow where no shadow should be. A silhouette sliding across the stars like a stain moving against the sky. It was subtle, almost impossible to detect unless you were looking straight at it. The slightest distortion in the starlight's pattern. Fowler's breath tightened in his throat. "I've got him," he whispered, more to himself than to his operator. He pushed the throttle forward. The engines roared softly, carrying the Beaufighter toward its prey. The German night fighter ahead of them had no idea. Its navigation lights flashed faintly, tiny pulses of white and green that seemed absurdly bright to Fowler's night-adjusted eyes. He saw the faint glow of the German exhaust stacks, the shimmering halo of heat around the aircraft's engines. The Luftwaffe pilot flew confidently, unaware that the rules of night combat had shifted beneath him. Fowler descended slightly, sliding under the German's tail. The darkness wrapped around his aircraft like a cloak, swallowing his silhouette, merging him with the void. The German crew never looked back. They had no reason to. Until this moment, night combat had always depended on visibility. If you saw nothing, you assumed nothing was there. Fowler lined up the shot. His finger tightened around the trigger. The moment stretched, quiet, suspended, eternal. The night sky over Europe in 1941 was a strange kind of battlefield, one that neither side fully understood yet. It wasn't silent. Engines droned in the distance, anti-aircraft guns thumped far below, and the wind hissed along the wings. But it was blind, black, disorienting. A darkness so deep it swallowed entire bomber streams whole. And inside that darkness, the RAF found itself fighting an enemy it couldn't see, while the Luftwaffe hunted with growing confidence. German night fighters, guided by ground-based searchlights and a new system of radar and radio beacons, were cutting British bombers out of the sky at a rate that rattled Bomber Command to its core. Crews began whispering about invisible hunters slipping up behind them, unseen until cannon fire tore through their fuselage. Something had to change, and the change began with a question so simple it almost sounded reckless. What if the RAF stopped trying to be seen? Because up until then, even at night, aircraft were seen. Not clearly, not brightly, but RAF night fighters and bombers still used faint navigation lights, identification lamps, and dim cockpit glows so they didn't collide with each other in the darkness. Every aircraft in the air had some kind of visual signature, small points of light drifting across the sky like fireflies. Even dim lights gave away position once eyes adjusted. Even the glow of an instrument panel could reflect faintly onto a canopy. Even the faintest exhaust flame could betray an aircraft against the stars. The Luftwaffe depended on those glimmers. German pilots were trained to watch for silhouettes, to scan for flashes, to wait for the faintest twinkle that betrayed a bomber's location. Ground controllers pushed their night fighters into perfect intercept paths. The Himmelbett radar system funneled them into striking position. And once a German aircraft was close enough, visual acquisition often came from tiny details, little reflections, faint glows, thin outlines. RAF pilots began to realize that as long as they gave off any light, even the slightest, they were targets. And so a new tactic began to form, slowly at first, experimental, almost forbidden. Turn off the lights. All of them. It sounded suicidal. Without lights, night collisions seemed inevitable. Pilots feared mid-air crashes, especially with densely packed bomber streams. Some crews protested. Others thought it would only worsen navigation problems. But the tiny handful of night fighter pilots who tried it in controlled tests noticed something extraordinary. When they switched off every visible light in their cockpit, covering gauges, dimming internal bulbs, killing external navigation lamps, even taping over stray reflections, visibility didn't get worse. It got better. Not inside the aircraft. Inside was blackness. But outside, the sky opened up. A pilot flying with full dark adaptation could pick out silhouettes he'd never noticed before. The faint blot where a bomber cut across the stars, the thin gray line of exhaust shimmering against moonlight, the flash of an engine through thin cloud. Once the cockpit lights were gone, the night itself became brighter, not in a literal sense, but in the way shadows reveal shapes when you stop staring into flame. RAF intelligence began collecting testimonies, and the pattern was unmistakable. Pilots who flew fully dark could see German night fighters before the Germans saw them. Pilots who flew lit, even dimly, were detected first and usually killed first. The tactical advantage was enormous, but the psychological shift was even larger. Turning off the lights meant putting total trust in instruments touched only by fingertips, in a horizon you couldn't see, in the sensation of flight rather than the image of it. It was like flying inside a sensory deprivation tank while searching for enemies who still believed you were glowing like a lantern. The first time RAF crews flew into enemy territory with every lamp extinguished, something remarkable happened. German night fighters flew right past them. Not close enough to collide, but close enough that the British aircrews could see the dim blinking of German navigation lights sliding through the night like fish in black water. The Germans had no idea they were being watched. The reason is simple and entirely historical. The Luftwaffe still relied on visual cues, navigation lights, formation markers, recognition lamps, to maintain cohesion between their own night fighters. Their doctrine assumed the enemy was also visible. German night fighter crews were trained to look for faint glows. They had never expected an enemy to turn into pure darkness. The British realized this gave them more than just survival. It gave them the ability to stalk. For the first time, RAF night fighters, especially Beaufighters and later Mosquitos, found they could slip behind German aircraft without being detected. British airborne radar, Mk4 and later Mk8, could guide them to within a few hundred yards of a target. From that point on, it had always been the same struggle. Find the silhouette before the silhouette found you. With lights off, that struggle vanished. The German pilot stared into the night, unaware that the faint starlight glinting on his canopy was also revealing the curve of his fuselage, just enough for a fully dark-adapted British pilot to see. The lights-off tactic turned RAF night fighters into predators, and Luftwaffe night fighters into prey. Soon, British night fighter squadrons began flying entire missions in darkness so total that even the glow from cigarette tips was banned. Pilots taped over any reflective metal. Some removed luminous paint from their gauges. Crews wore black scarves to prevent any hint of skin reflection. Aircraft fuselages were painted in ultramatte black so they wouldn't reflect moonlight. Even the exhaust stacks were modified with flame dampers to kill the orange jet of burning fuel that made aircraft visible for miles away. The sky became a hunting ground, and the British learned to move through it unseen. German crews began reporting mysterious ambushes, night fighters being destroyed without warning, bombers being struck from behind by attackers they had never spotted, radar operators hearing nothing before impacts. They wrote in reports that the British materialize out of nothing, that they are invisible until the moment they fire. They were right. The RAF wanted to be nothing, because nothing was deadly. The effectiveness only grew as the Mosquito, fast, silent, agile, entered night fighter service. The Mossie, already a phantom by day, became something closer to a myth by night. German crews began claiming the British had invented invisible aircraft. Others swore the Mossie made no sound at all. Some believed the RAF had found a way to hide their engines from radar entirely. They didn't understand the real answer. The RAF hadn't hidden their engines. They'd hidden their presence. They had simply vanished into the night. The shift didn't happen overnight. It spread across RAF squadrons the way a rumor spreads in a mess hall. Quietly at first, passed between men who had seen something unusual, something they couldn't quite explain except through sensation. Pilots who returned from lights-out flights described the same eerie adjustment. How the night slowly peeled back its layers once their eyes had fully adapted. How the sky became textured instead of empty. How the faintest glow of a German exhaust stack, something invisible to crews flying with illuminated cockpits, suddenly stood out like a smoldering coal held beneath a blanket. They talked about spotting silhouettes at distances that shouldn't have been possible, about tracking bombers by the thin shadow they cast across starlight, about how aircraft that had always seemed to appear out of nowhere now appeared gradually, inevitably, like ships rising over a black ocean. RAF leadership began paying attention to these stories because they aligned perfectly with another set of observations. Luftwaffe night fighters were scoring kills at a frightening rate, and they were doing it because they saw the British before the British saw them. Even small illumination inside a cockpit leaked outward, reflections off glass, metal, fabric, even skin. It didn't take much. A dim instrument lamp, a faint glow from a chart table, the flicker of a radio display. Anything inside the cockpit could scatter across the canopy and silhouette the pilot's face from the outside. German crews have been trained to look for those clues, to search for the faint signature of a bomber against the faint band of light that hovered over the horizon. The RAF gradually understood that even a weak glow could betray them long before their own eyes had adjusted enough to see anything in return. This realization collided with another truth. German night fighters were relying heavily on visual confirmation. Radar could guide them in broadly, could place them within a few hundred yards of the target, But the final phase, finding the exact aircraft in the darkness, still depended on eyesight. Himmelbett ground controllers could place a night fighter in the right patch of sky, but they couldn't make the pilot see. That fragile moment, that last few seconds where the German pilot scanned the dark hoping to make out the silhouette of a bomber, became the opening the RAF needed. Turn off the lights, and that last step broke entirely. German pilots overshot their prey. They drifted beneath bombers without noticing them. They flew in parallel paths without ever sensing another aircraft only a few hundred yards away. Everything the Luftwaffe had built for night interception depended on the assumption that the enemy could be seen at the final moment. Take away visibility, and the entire structure, radar, searchlights, night fighters, ground control, became a house losing its foundation stone. RAF night fighter crews took this to heart. What began as a risky experiment evolved into a practiced discipline. Pilots no longer trusted faint cockpit illumination. Instead, they learned to touch their controls by memory. Gauge faces were shadowed, sometimes taped over except for a tiny slit that let just enough moonlight catch the needles. Navigators used red torchlight sparingly, cupping their hands tightly around the beam so no glow leaked into the cockpit. Even the simple act of turning a page on a clipboard became a careful maneuver. One flash of white paper could ruin 10 minutes of dark adaptation. Every movement inside the aircraft was designed to protect night vision, because night vision was now a weapon. This discipline extended to the aircraft themselves. Crews called ground crewmen over to point out every reflective surface, every rivet that glinted beneath a work lamp, every seam where moonlight might catch. They repainted aircraft with deeper matte finishes. They blackened screws, instrument bezels, buttons, even the edges of the canopy frames. They wore darker gloves, darker scarves, darker flight helmets. They removed shiny objects from their pockets. Some even rubbed soot into their gear to reduce reflectivity. The goal wasn't to become invisible to radar. That would have been impossible. The goal was to become invisible to the human eye. Because the final judge of who lived and who died during night interception was always sight. Imperfect, limited, strained human sight. And the RAF learned that sight could be defeated without technology. It could be defeated with darkness. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe struggled to understand why their night fighters were suddenly missing their targets. Reports from German crews grew increasingly confused. Some claimed British bombers had begun using special paint that absorbed moonlight. Others swore they had heard British night fighters nearby. Engine hums ghosting through the sky, yet saw nothing. Some insisted the RAF must be flying higher or lower than expected, perhaps hugging cloud layers more precisely. No one imagined the British were simply darkening themselves to the point of invisibility. Night fighter controllers in the Kammhuber line, the intricate network of radar zones that guided German interceptors, found themselves confronting a strange new pattern. Radar showed British bombers entering a sector, but the night fighters sent to intercept them returned empty-handed. Searchlights caught nothing. Visual sightings plummeted. And when the RAF began using night fighters of their own to stalk German night fighters, the situation deteriorated further. German crews began falling to attacks they never saw coming. A night fighter would be following a bomber stream one moment and erupting in a fire the next, destroyed by an enemy they had no indication was present. The panic was real. German debriefings spoke of shadow aircraft, black phantoms, and the silent enemy. They had no vocabulary for what was happening because no doctrine had prepared them for it. The idea that an aircraft could deliberately extinguish every light and fight blind seemed suicidal, until the RAF proved it wasn't blind at all. It was simply using a different kind of sight. British airborne radar gave them the approach. Darkness gave them the kill. The tactic evolved rapidly. British crews discovered that extinguishing lights didn't just improve offensive capability, it improved survival. Bombers flying with no lights became harder to intercept. Night fighters flying with no lights became nearly impossible to ambush. Crews began timing their light extinguishing to coincide with specific zones, crossing the coast, approaching German radar arcs, flying near known night fighter airfields. The lights would go out in one motion, a ritual that marked the transition from travel to combat. Inside the cockpit, everything shifted: the mood, the tension, the awareness. The men aboard leaned forward slightly, Voices quieter, eyes wider, breathing slower. They were entering the invisible world, and that invisible world rewrote everything. Suddenly, the Mosquito, fast, quiet, lightweight, found its perfect domain. In daylight, it was fast enough to outrun most fighters. At night, with its lights extinguished and its silhouette swallowed by the sky, it became something beyond a fighter. It became a predator of predators. It honed in on German night fighters returning to base, catching them at their most vulnerable. Engines throttled back, crew fatigued, visibility limited. It followed the glow of exhaust as German aircraft descended toward lit runways. It waited until the last moment, until the German pilot committed a landing, then struck with brutal efficiency before disappearing again into the void. German ground crews began finding the remains of their best night fighter, aces, shot down only miles from their own airfields. They couldn't explain how the British had found them. They assumed spies on the ground were signaling their locations. They never realized it was their own runway lights betraying them while British aircraft flew dark above. Turning off the lights didn't just help the RAF hide. It made the Luftwaffe visible. The collapse of German night fighter confidence didn't happen in one dramatic moment. It eroded slowly, like a wooden beam rotting from the inside, until the whole structure suddenly sagged. At first, Luftwaffe commanders simply assumed the British had changed their flight paths. Then they blamed weather, thick clouds, moonless nights, the distortion of radar signals by winter air. But as the weeks passed, the pattern became too consistent to ignore. Night fighter crews returned with the same haunted look, the same hollow explanations, the same insistence that the enemy was no longer where he should be. They flew intercept vectors perfectly, flew through the bomber stream, flew the exact altitude and heading ground controllers issued, and found nothing. That wasn't supposed to happen. The entire Kammhuber line, the pride of the German night defense, was built on predictability. Radar-detected bombers, ground controllers assigned night fighters closed to visual contact, and visual contact secured the kill. But visual contact was precisely what the RAF deprived them of. What British crews understood that German doctrine still ignored was that night fighting wasn't controlled by radar alone. It was controlled by human eyes. And human eyes, when deprived of light, become helpless. The moment RAF crews realized this, everything shifted. They started treating light like a weapon, something that could expose you or protect you depending on how it was used. German crews, on the other hand, still believed a small amount of light was necessary for coordination. They kept formation lights dimly lit while assembling. They used recognition lamps when nearing friendly airfields. Their cockpit gauges glowed softly behind curtains. Their exhaust flames flickered like faint candles in the sky. They believed the darkness was their cover. They never understood that to a British pilot staring into pure black, even those faint glimmers were beacons. The Mosquito squadrons exploited this ruthlessly. As radar technology improved, British AI sets gave night fighters a reliable way to get close. Close enough that turning off their own lights transformed them into nothing. Inside a dark cockpit, pilots would lean forward, pressing their eyes to the canopy, searching for the smallest signature. Sometimes they saw only a hazy smudge, a vague distortion where moonlight scattered differently. Sometimes they saw nothing at all, until suddenly the vague image of a tailplane materialized only a few hundred yards ahead. The tension of those moments carved itself into memory. The way the night seemed to breathe, the way your heartbeat slowed as you eased in a firing position, the way your hands had to remain steady even though every part of your mind screamed that you were too close, too blind, too vulnerable. But those were the missions that changed the war. In the darkness, the Mosquito needed no lights because the enemy gave off just enough. German pilots never imagined an aircraft could get that close without being detected. Many refused to believe they had been stalked from behind. They insisted the RAF must have dropped from above or dove in from the side. But British combat reports repeatedly described the same phenomenon. They followed German night fighters for minutes, sometimes tens of minutes, without the Germans realizing they were there. They matched throttle settings so precisely that their engine pitch blended into the night. They adjusted altitude by feet rather than yards. They moved with the patience of hunters creeping toward an animal that trusted the cover of the forest too much. One of the great paradoxes of night combat emerged during these missions. The better trained German night fighter crews were, the easier the Mosquitos could kill them. Elite German pilots flew smoother, more predictable patterns. They maintained altitude carefully, kept bank angle steady, kept headings constant. They made themselves ideal shadows to intercept. The average pilot who flew erratically, climbing and descending, zigzagging out of nerves, was far harder for radar-guided Mosquitos to follow. But the aces, the skilled hunters of the early war, became prey to the very discipline they relied on. British crews knew this. They actively sought the smoother flights, the more stable radar returns, the aircraft that fit the profile of trained killers. Meanwhile, the Camhuber line strained under pressure. What had once been a meticulously organized tapestry of radar zones began to unravel as British tactics evolved. The Germans built the system on the assumption that bomber streams would be visible, that their lights and silhouettes would betray them eventually. They never prepared for a bomber force that moved like ghosts. British heavies flying with lights out became ambiguous masses on radar, difficult to track, difficult to guide night fighters toward. And when Mosquito intruders began attacking German night fighters returning home, the system cracked a little more. The Camhuber line was supposed to provide safe lanes back to airfields. Instead, returning pilots started dying right above their runways. The psychological effects were devastating. German night fighter crews, once among the most confident aviators in the Luftwaffe, began flying with their heads twisting left and right, checking their 6 o'clock obsessively. Some turned off their own lights, violating doctrine. Others throttled back and drifted into lower altitudes to avoid being silhouetted by runway lights. Some abandoned formation landings entirely, scattering like frightened birds rather than risk being an easy target. Ground controllers complained that pilots no longer followed approach instructions. Pilots complained that ground controllers were sending them into ambushes. No one understood that the RAF was simply stepping behind their aircraft while flying in total darkness. British night fighter crews trained relentlessly to thrive in these conditions. They sat in darkened hangars for long periods before flights, letting their eyes adapt. They learned to distinguish shades of black, where the sky met the horizon, where thin wisps of cloud drifted silently through the night. They practiced scanning techniques to prevent the loss of night vision. They memorized instrument positions by fingertip, so they never had to risk turning on a light. They trained their bodies to remain still enough that even a subtle shift in weight wouldn't change the silhouette of the aircraft or reflect light across the canopy. And the more they practiced, the more the Luftwaffe faltered. Every night that passed with RAF fighters extinguishing their lights chipped away at German doctrine. The wild sow tactic, single-seat fighters attacking bombers visually, became increasingly risky because the RAF night fighters hit at altitudes German pilots needed to climb through. Radar-controlled twin-engine fighters fared little better. Their controllers tracked bombers, but couldn't detect British shadowers escorting them. The Germans built new radar systems, improved detection ranges, and tried every countermeasure they could imagine. None of it solved the same fundamental problem. No machine can meaningfully detect an aircraft the human eye is blind to, if the human eye is part of the interception process. So the RAF pushed harder into darkness. They began entering German airspace earlier in pitch black, long before German night fighters took off. They hovered over airfields, watching for the faint light of runway beacons being switched on. They lurked above approach paths. They learned that German crews flying home, fatigued, low on fuel, minds dulled by hours in the dark, were perfect targets. They studied landing procedures, circling patterns, timing between aircraft. They knew when each aircraft would drop its gear. They knew when the engine note changed. They knew how close a night fighter had to be before the ground crew shone a signal lamp. Every bit of light the Germans used to help their own pilots land also helped the British kill them. Turning off the lights didn't just let RAF fighters hide. It turned German lights into traps. And as Mosquito squadrons grew more experienced, a new layer of psychological warfare emerged. German pilots no longer trusted the darkness, but they no longer trusted the light either. They were trapped in a world where visibility itself became dangerous. If they turned their own lights off, they risked collision or misidentifying friendlies. If they turned them on, They risked being seen by a hunter they couldn't detect. That was the genius of the RAF's decision. Darkness became a battlefield they controlled. Light became a weapon they could exploit. And the Luftwaffe found itself fighting an enemy it could not see, could not track, and increasingly could not understand. German airfields in 1943 began to feel less like strongholds and more like stages in an invisible play. Every floodlight, every illuminated hangar doorway, every runway lamp that flickered on for a landing turned the entire base into a spotlighted target. Ground crews, once confident as they prepared returning night fighters, now worked with a tension that seeped into everything they did. They whispered instead of shouted. They checked the sky compulsively. They listened for engines that shouldn't be there. Engines without lights. Engines without silhouettes. Engines without warning. Because they had learned the hard way that the Mosquitos didn't announce themselves. They didn't circle. They didn't dive like Stukas or howl like strafing 109s. They simply appeared. One moment the runway was empty. The next a burning German aircraft was sliding across it. Fuel lines ruptured by cannon shells from a British night intruder that vanished back into the darkness before anyone could even spot it. The reason was painfully simple. Visibility served the RAF far more than the Luftwaffe once the British turned their own lights off. The glow from a runway was visible for miles away. The shimmer of a landing light slicing across a cockpit canopy was visible from even farther. The faint beam of a signal lamp, green for clearance, red for go-around, was enough for a dark-adapted RAF pilot to position himself in perfect ambush. The Germans needed these lights to guide their pilots home. Without them, landings became catastrophic. But with them, the Mosquitos could pick off aircraft with chilling precision. German defensive doctrine began to crumble under this contradiction. Some airfields experimented with blackout landings, instructing pilots to land with minimal lighting or none at all. But the accidents piled up. Aircraft overshot runways, collapsed gear, crashed into trees. Others clipped the edges of hangars or hit ground vehicles whose drivers couldn't see them. Pilots hated blackout landings. They were exhausted, stressed, and flying heavy twin-engine machines that responded sluggishly at low speeds. Every night ended with wrecks that had nothing to do with the RAF and everything to do with the growing desperation of German command. And the RAF knew this. They saw the wreckage from above. They documented the fires. They recorded radio chatter. They reported how many German aircraft never even reached the runway. Darkness had become a weapon long before a single shot was fired. Meanwhile, inside RAF night fighter squadrons, the transformation from lit flight to black flight became ritualized. Crews treated the extinguishing of lights as the moment a mission truly began. Pilots sat in their aircraft minutes before takeoff with their eyes closed, forcing themselves into the slow rhythm of breathing that improved night sight adaptation. They didn't speak unless necessary, because even the act of looking toward the person talking could disrupt focus. When the engines roared to life and the aircraft taxied toward the runway, the inside of the cockpit remained a chamber of absolute blackness. Occasionally, a sliver of distant moonlight caught the edge of a panel or the smooth curve of a glove, but otherwise the pilot flew not by vision, but by memory, where every switch lived, where every dial sat, where every vibration meant something. Once airborne and clear of crowded British airspace, the transformation finished. One by one, with practiced precision, the crew extinguished every remaining source of light. The cockpit went from dim to dark, from dark to abyssal, from abyssal to a strange, floating nothingness where even the boundaries of the canopy seemed to fade. The pilot couldn't see the wings except when a slice of starlight brushed them briefly. He couldn't see his own legs. The only visible reference was the faint, ghostly glow of phosphorescent paint on certain key instruments, just enough to prevent disorientation, but not enough to reflect outward. In that moment, the aircraft became a speck of nothing moving through a universe of dark air. And this nothingness gave them dominance, because everything the Germans relied on still emitted light. The Luftwaffe depended heavily on the Schrage Music upward-firing cannons that tore open the bellies of British bombers. These cannons required the pilot to visually line up the bomber above him. But German pilots approaching RAF aircraft could no longer find them. The British bombers flying completely dark blended into the night sky. Even moonlit clouds only helped the British crews, who learned to position themselves in shadows cast by cloud banks, valleys of darkness cut between patches of pale sky. The Germans hunted blind, while the British fed on the faintest traces of scattered starlight. British radar operators reported a new pattern emerging. When they followed an incoming German night fighter, using AI radar to stay a few hundred yards behind, they would observe German crews nervously fishtailing, bobbing, climbing, descending, turning wildly in attempts to shake attackers they couldn't see. The Mosquito pilot would simply match these movements, staying just far enough to remain undetected, yet close enough to observe. Sometimes it took 10 minutes, 15, even 20 of silent stalking before the perfect firing angle appeared. German pilots suffered the psychological torment of sensing danger without perceiving it. Their instruments showed nothing. Their radar operator reported nothing. Their eyes found nothing. But something in the night felt wrong, like a presence behind them, a shift in the wind, a pressure in the darkness. Some pilots later wrote that they began imagining phantoms. Others prayed more during landings than they did during combat. Many did not survive long enough to explain anything at all. Back in Germany, the Kammhuber line controllers tried to adapt. They widened radar corridors. They added more listening posts. They attempted to guide night fighters to intercept points based solely on radio triangulation. But none of these measures compensated for the absence of visual confirmation. Even when German radar placed a night fighter within a few hundred meters of a bomber, the final step, the step that had always mattered most, failed. German pilots flying with even minimal cockpit illumination had their eyes constantly resetting, losing dark adaptation, losing the subtle ability to read the night's shadows. British crews flying completely lightless did not have this problem. They lived in the darkness. They allowed it to carve itself into their senses until their perception became a kind of second sight. And when the Mosquito intruders entered the picture, the entire German night defense structure faltered. These intruder missions were not simply harassment. They were strategic. Mosquitoes slipped into German airspace ahead of the bomber streams, gliding low over forests, rivers, and towns that glowed faintly with blackout violating lights. They watched as German night fighters warmed up their engines on the tarmac. They observed runway patterns and taxi routes. They learned the timing of night fighter scrambles. They even memorized the distinctive lighting configurations of specific airfields. When the first German night fighter lifted into the air, its landing lights flickered on for a second to adjust steering, and that faint blink, just a fraction of a second, was all a Mosquito needed to begin the hunt. Sometimes the British fighters waited until the German pilot switched off his lights again, thinking he was safe. Sometimes they waited until he climbed an altitude bands the RAF knew he would use. Sometimes they waited until he descended again at shift's end. But no matter when the ambush happened, the German crews wrote afterward that they felt utterly helpless. They could not understand how an enemy could appear from nothingness, attack, and then evaporate before any defensive maneuver worked. Once the RAF turned off their lights, the Germans could no longer fight the night. They could only survive it, and even that became harder as the war went on. Nothing made this clearer than the reports filed by German night fighter aces who had once been masters of the darkness. They complained bitterly that the stars seemed dimmer, that the night had become hostile, that flying felt like moving through ink. What they didn't realize was that the night had not changed at all. The RAF simply stopped lighting themselves within it. The Germans had been fighting shadows since the beginning. They just hadn't realized those shadows could decide to become fully invisible. The more the RAF embraced absolute darkness, the more the Luftwaffe lost its one remaining advantage: experience. Night fighting had been a German specialty early in the war. Their systems were refined, their training intense, their radar sophisticated. But none of that mattered if the final act of interception, identifying and engaging the enemy visually, became impossible. The RAF stripped away the foundation of German night doctrine not with new weapons, but by removing light. The unraveling of the German night defense network happened quietly, almost invisibly, until suddenly it could not be ignored. Himmelbett zones that once operated like clockwork, radar detecting, controllers vectoring, fighters intercepting, began to falter in every stage. Ground stations tracked bomber streams entering their airspace, but failed to translate those tracks into successful interceptions. Night fighters climbed obediently into the sky, followed their vectors, leveled into the predicted bomber lanes, and found only darkness. They searched for silhouettes where they had always seen them before, where doctrine, experience, and instinct told them British aircraft must be. But now the darkness gave nothing back. The bombers were still there. The radar confirmed that. But the pilot's eyes, once the final link in the chain, now failed consistently. Night after night, German crews returned home empty-handed, embarrassed, irritated, or shaken, unable to explain how they could be placed within a few hundred yards of a bomber and still see absolutely nothing. At first, commanders blamed weather patterns. They blamed cloud layers, temperature inversions, new jamming techniques, even the possibility that the British had altered their cruising altitudes. They studied wind patterns, moon phases, humidity charts, trying to pinpoint what had changed in the night skies over Europe. But nothing in nature had shifted. What changed was that the British simply stopped glowing, stopped silhouetting themselves, stopped giving the German anything to latch onto. They had removed the final breadcrumb in a system that relied on visual contact, and the German night fighters were left wandering through a tunnel with the light at the end snuffed out. This breakdown was not merely technical. It was psychological. Night fighter pilots who once prided themselves on sharp eyes and steady nerves began doubting their own senses. They stared harder into the night, strained their eyes until they burned, but still saw nothing but an enormous field of black stretching endlessly forward. Hours of high-intensity searching without a single visual confirmation exhausted them mentally. Fatigue set in faster. Reaction times slowed. And when the RAF night fighters began hunting them instead of waiting to be hunted, that exhaustion turned to dread. One of the most feared elements of this shift was the RAF's use of intruder tactics, carried out almost exclusively by Mosquito squadrons. These missions targeted German night fighter operations directly. While bombers struck industrial sites, Mosquitos swept through German airspace, searching for night fighters taking off, landing, or forming up near their home airfields. German ground crews learned to dread the sound of a Mosquito engine overhead because it meant the British had slipped into their airspace undetected, found their runways by the faint halo of light they cast, and were waiting to pounce. Pilots returning home from long, exhausting missions would switch on their landing lights for a brief moment, and that flash of visibility became a death sentence. Mosquitoes diving silently out of the dark tore into them from behind or above, destroying them just as they prepared to land. German commanders tried to counter this by restricting light usage, but they were trapped by the same paradox. Without lights, their own pilots could not land safely. With lights, they died. The Luftwaffe introduced new radar systems, such as the SN-2 Liechtenstein set, designed to help crews track targets without visual cues. Initially, this radar seemed revolutionary. Its longer wavelength allowed it to detect aircraft at greater distances and in cluttered airspace. But even this had limitations. The SN-2 produced large, imprecise blobs on the radar screen, leaving crews uncertain whether they were closing on an enemy or drifting past one. Pilots still needed to confirm visually before firing, and that confirmation never came. The RAF's decision to extinguish all lights rendered SN-2 incomplete. It guided crews to the general vicinity of bombers, but not to the final invisible target, hiding in darkness deeper than the German eye could penetrate. Naxos, a radar detector designed to pick up emissions from British H-2S radar, offered another temporary advantage to German night fighters. But again, it couldn't solve the same core problem, locating the aircraft visually. Even when Naxos pointed a night fighter toward a bomber, the British crews, flying completely dark, blended into the night's natural texture. German pilots knew bombers had to be right in front of them. Their instruments confirmed as much. And yet nothing appeared. Their senses betrayed them. The night betrayed them. Doctrine betrayed them. And the British exploited every blind spot. As failures increased, German crews began altering their behavior in ways that reflected growing desperation. Some pilots flew at wildly varying altitudes, hoping to catch bombers from below or above at random angles. Others cut power intermittently to listen for other aircraft in the dark, a tactic that seldom worked and often caused dangerous stalls. Some simply refused night missions altogether, claiming mechanical issues or fuel shortages rather than face invisible enemies. Reports of ghost aircraft began circulating in squadron briefings, not because German pilots believed in supernatural forces, but because the Mosquitos behaved in ways that defied everything they understood about air combat. Pilots spoke of hearing engines behind them with no visual contact, of feeling turbulence caused by another aircraft they could not see, of being attacked from perfectly blind angles. The terror was silent, suffocating, and relentless. It hollowed out morale the way rot hollows out a support beam. Even the most experienced crews walked toward their aircraft at dusk with stiffness in their shoulders and a quiet dread behind their eyes. The once proud German night fighter arm, which had dominated the early years of nocturnal air combat, now felt hunted in a sky it no longer controlled. Mosquito crews took advantage of this collapse with increasing precision. RAF intruders didn't just attack airfields randomly. They studied German routines. They memorized the timing of night fighter scrambles, the altitudes at which they assembled, the routes they took into their sectors, the times they returned to base. They knew which airfields kept their lights on longer, which used flares along the runway, which relied heavily on signal lamps for communication. A single flicker of light could reveal the pattern of an entire night fighter regiment, and British crews capitalized on every glimmer. As the tide turned ever more decisively, the Germans tried one last set of countermeasures. They experimented with new formations, flying tighter together to help identify each other visually. This proved disastrous. In the dark, with eyes constantly failing to adjust, collisions increased. They tried flying in dispersed patterns, hoping to draw British fighters into empty stretches of sky. This resulted in confusion and isolation. They lit decoy airfields to distract intruders, but the Mosquito crews learned to spot the telltale differences almost instantly. Every German tactic broke itself against the British commitment to total darkness. By 1944, the Kammhuber line, once the pride of the Luftwaffe, was effectively shattered. RAF bomber losses from night fighters decreased drastically. German interception rates plummeted, and Mosquito intruder squadrons claimed an ever-growing tally of night fighters destroyed or damaged. The night became British territory, not because of any single technological breakthrough, but because of a simple, powerful truth. Darkness was a resource, and the RAF learned how to master it. The decision to turn off lights was not just a tactic. It became a philosophy, a reimagining of what night combat meant. The RAF stopped trying to fight the night and instead embraced it fully, letting it swallow their aircraft whole. In that void, they discovered a new kind of warfare, one where the absence of light was as potent as any weapon, where visibility became vulnerability, and where the pilot who surrendered his own sight could dominate the pilot who still depended on it. By the final year of the war, Luftwaffe night fighter crews understood the truth they had refused to face. The British were no longer fighting in the night. The British were fighting as the night, and darkness, once an obstacle, became their greatest ally, one that no German innovation could ever fully overcome.